learning with the Peltzman group. For those who are new to Peltzman, it's a well known that when the Jews were leaving Egypt, the Israelites that would end up in Kansas City met every week for the Peltzman learning program. This is well known. And that is how long the Peltzman learning program has been going on, is since the Exodus from Egypt. There would one day be a woman, her name would be Sarah Peltzman, and there would be a learning series named in her honor. And but in all seriousness, this learning program has gone on uninterrupted, Shira, for how many years? Like 40 years, right?
Quite a while. Do you know exactly, Amy?
Amy or Carol? How many years have we been doing Peltzman uninterrupted? I think like 40 years.
At least. I know, boy, I wish Alice was still here because Alice would have that answer. Yeah.
Yes.
It's been quite, it's been at least 40.
It's been at least 40 years. So that's incredible for an education program to be going on uninterrupted for that long anywhere in America. And we're still getting like a robust turnout, and it's just great. It's so inspiring, and you guys have learned with a series of different teachers. My unit that we're going to be talking about this week, or this next few weeks, is going to be on the idea of machloket. Machloket means disagreement. Okay. Raise your hand if you've ever heard the term machloket. Okay, so I'm gonna, maybe if you feel comfortable raising your hand, and then I'll unmute you to share with us in what context you've heard that term, in how you've used it, and what I'd like you to share is, has it been something positive or something negative? As the term machloket means something positive or something negative. Jill, I think I saw your hand up. Was your hand up? You're muted. Unmute, please.
My hand was up when you asked if anybody had heard the term. And then when I thought about it, I've heard it, but I can't remember in which context it was. So okay, I will pass.
You'll pass. Okay. Anybody else want to share the context that they've heard it in, and was it a positive or a negative term?
Well, Rabbi Hillel and Shammai had disagreements when they were studying.
Okay, great. So, I think we have discovered the person responsible for our echo. Yes.
Sorry, I'll turn it.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But good. Yeah, Hillel and Shammai is one of the definitions of a machloket, and I'm going to circle back to that terminology with them in one moment. Anybody else have they heard about it? Have they heard it before? And want to share? Yeah, Naomi, please.
In a Talmud study class, where you look at the differences of opinion between many different rabbis.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is so the term machloket comes from the Hebrew word chelek, chet lamed kuf. Let me see. Do I have a whiteboard on here? I don't. Okay, let me share my Word. I'm going to share a Word document. Just a second, I'll make that my whiteboard. Give me just 1 second, my friends. Okay. Okay. A machloket literally comes from the Hebrew word chelek, which means a piece or a part of something. So now that I've shared with you that definition, that machloket is the thing that divides something into pieces or parts, now how does that word sound to you? Does it sound, is it negative? Is it positive? Does it teach us something else about the word? Yeah, Carol, what do you think? Unmute, please.
I don't know what the answer to the question you just gave, but the English word, anyway, argument, to me is different from disagreement. And we're not talking Hebrew, we're talking English. An argument has negative tones, whereas a disagreement doesn't.
Right. So I'm gonna, yeah. So I'm going to share my thing again. So think of it like this. Think about this. Machloket is something that divides something. Okay. Here's the whole. And then the machloket is the thing that maybe divides the whole.
Oh, it divides.
It splits the whole into pieces. But in a sense, the only way, if you don't have both sides of a machloket, you don't have all the parts to make the full circle. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And the rabbis talk about two kinds of machloket. A machloket l'shem shamayim, a machloket that's for the sake of heaven, and a machloket that's lo l'shem shamayim, that's not for the sake of heaven. And when you have a machloket l'shem shamayim, they say it is destined to endure. And they talk about that as the machlokot, like Marge brought up, between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were two actual sages. They actually lived. They were actual rabbis. But what they're known for is that they created two schools of thought: Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, and Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel. And these became two schools of thought within the early rabbinic community. And there were actually, they had disciples, and that created, sort of ways of interpreting Jewish law. And you see arguments in the Talmud. The Talmud is a vast work that covers literally centuries over its pages. And you'll see both arguments between actually Hillel and Shammai, the actual people, but more often what you see when they talk about is Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, students of those schools of thought, that they would be in the academy, in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study together, and we would see arguments between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. That, they say, is a machloket l'shem shamayim. It's a machloket that's destined to endure. And arguments of Supreme Court, opinions of majority and dissents could be considered machloket l'shem shamayim, yes. Well, that's interesting, except Derek's asked a question is, could we make an analogy between Supreme Court decisions where we have a minority opinion or a dissenting opinion that's like a machloket l'shem shamayim. I think I'll tell you where I think the similarity is, and I'll tell you where I think the differences are. The similarity is that there's this idea of enduring worth or value to the dissenting opinion. And that's why it is given the honor of being recorded. And I remember hearing some just beautiful and powerful eulogies following the passing of Justice Ginsburg on how some of her dissenting opinions ultimately became canonized in law. They lost on the field of the Supreme Court, but then it went back to the legislature, and the legislature ultimately passed laws in accordance with Justice Ginsburg's opinion. And because the role of the Supreme Court is to interpret a law and say, is this law constitutional or unconstitutional? And so, like, and I'm forgetting the exact case that it was, and somebody would, maybe Naomi or somebody with a stronger legal background than myself, can put the exact citation in the chat window. But there were cases that the Supreme Court said, no, the law itself, as it's written, is not unconstitutional. So the law stands. But then Congress came back and said, you're right, the law isn't constitutional, which means that now it's our job as the legislative branch to write new law. And we have to write new law that's different than the pre-existing code because it may not rise to the level of unconstitutionality, but it's not the way that we want the law to be, but the way that the legal system in America is set up is it has to be decided by the legislature. So I think that that's a really good analogy. The one difference I would say is when the Supreme Court rules on something, even if there's a minority opinion, you can't have a subcommunity that follows the minority opinion. That the Supreme Court, by definition, rules over is the law of the entire land. So I don't remember does somebody with a better history memory than me remember what the breakdown was on Brown v. Board of Education? It wasn't a unanimous decision, correct? Somebody want to Google it? Well, whatever it was, let's say it wasn't a unanimous decision. You couldn't have a southern city that wanted to remain segregated in the school. They say, no, our municipality is going to follow the dissenting opinion because there's a few Supreme Court justices that ruled like us, and separate but equal is actually okay. Like that doesn't work. And so for Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel within their own self-contained sub-communities to continue to follow their customs. But when like you had to make a ruling for a specific town, a specific, whatever, you would follow one opinion or the other, and certainly for future generations. Yeah, the difference between interpretations versus rulings. Yes, exactly. And what we're going to get into later on down the road is seeing how, what does pluralism look like? How can we have pluralism? How can we have actually different points of view? We deal with this all the time in the Jewish community, and we butt up against it a lot of what are the boundaries of pluralism, which we'll get to on, in a few segments. What are the boundaries of pluralism? Like we're okay with, we sort of have come to a certain agreement within the American Jewish community that we allow for a certain amount of pluralism. We say secular Jews, okay. We say Reform Jews, okay. We say Orthodox Jews, okay. We say conservative Jews, okay. We say ultra-Orthodox Jews are okay, part of the conversation. But we've made the decision, for example, that Jews for Jesus, not okay. We've said as a community that, you know what? Quote unquote messianics are not okay. They're out of here. If there is a messianic day school that gets built in Kansas City and they were to apply to the Federation for funding for this new messianic Jewish day school, they would get shoved out of that request meeting so quickly, and we have such animus towards this community in what I will call the mainstream Jewish community, for lack of a better term, that there are even discussions about like for example, at Slichot, some of you have been to Slichot. Slichot uses community-wide funding. We get grants from the Federation for that. Rabbis volunteer their time for it. Beth Torah usually, but it could be another synagogue, and we certainly have other communal programs where other synagogues donate their space, donate their security, donate their maintenance. There's a large group of organized people and agencies that contribute to making that shared space. And we get a lot of messianics who come to that. When I say a lot, I'm talking 20%. It's a lot. I mean, there have been many years at Slichot where we've had more members of messianics than we have had members of Beth Shalom. I don't say that with pride. And the question comes in, should we allow them to ask questions during the discussions of the classes when they are needling about Jesus in the discussions? It's an actual question that we've discussed. Because they actually do. They sometimes will use it as a platform for asking not what I will call questions with integrity. They are always asking about Christian-based questions. So we as a community have decided to put certain types of limits and restrictions. But by the way, 2,000 years ago, I hope I'm not saying anything controversial here. 2,000 years ago, at the beginning of Christianity, it was a lot mushier between Judaism and Christianity. And we might not have drawn such a thick line or built a high wall. By the way, in the 1980s and early 90s, many rabbis in the Chabad Lubavitch movement were openly saying that Rabbi Schneerson was the Mashiach. Openly. You would go down to Crown Heights. You can still see these signs. You would go down to Crown Heights. You would see flags and big, huge signs that have a picture of the Rebbe and say Moshiach underneath. That seems a lot like the kind of religion that's being espoused by what we call messianics. And yet we allowed them in the tent. We didn't shove them out. We allowed that to be an internal discussion to Chabad. Who's going to win the fight? Are the messianics going to win the fight, or the non-messianics going to win the fight? I'm not going to talk about Chabad politics internal because I'm not part of that community. But my point is that every Jewish community tries to figure out ways that we're going to draw the boundaries. Nobody would, if somebody started a secular Jewish cultural society and wanted to have it at the JCC or wanted to have it as part of Federation or even part of the academy, I doubt that anybody would say, sorry, no God? Yeah. We can't allow that in our community. I heard the member of the Knesset, Tzipi Livni, speaking at the AIPAC policy conference a few years ago, and she's very secular. And she gets up and she says, I was raised in a household that taught me that Judaism was the religion that believed in a maximum of one God. Wait, if you were to break down theology, like which is more controversial, no God or the Messianics? We've decided as a community that no God is less offensive than the Messianics. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm comfortable with that, but I could imagine someone being uncomfortable with it. We have basically decided the decision on the existence of the State of Israel as a mainstream Jewish community. If the Neturei Karta is a small subsection of Satmar Hasidim, who are adamantly and vehemently opposed to the existence of the State of Israel. Satmar Hasidim are too. But the Neturei Karta are more outside of the community preaching about it. And if there's any pro-Israel conference, national conference in Washington, D.C., you'll see the Neturei Karta out there with signs protesting, saying, boo, no Jewish state, with the long hats and the Streimelach and the payas. And you're like, these guys look as Jewish as can be, and yet they're holding signs saying we don't want a Jewish state. And the mainstream Jewish community is basically like, if somebody wanted to start a Neturei Karta youth group, and have little, teenage Neturei Karta anti-Zionist meetings, we would say, no funding for you, no meeting space for you. We are not going to accept it. So these are examples of how we work on the issues and dynamism of pluralism today in modern America. Any questions or ideas before we get into today's topic? So let me tell you overarching, what I actually think that the classical Jewish texts in the Talmud provide a very good model for how to disagree. I think the idea of machloket is actually a really valuable and worthwhile paradigm that America and the greater world, but particularly America, needs right now. We have forgotten how to disagree well. We don't know how to have a machloket l'shem shamayim anymore, to have a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven. And so we're going to study some different cases in the Talmud to look at how the rabbis manage disagreement. And but today, since today is Yom HaShoah, I wanted to set a special intention for today to do some studying in the name of Yom HaShoah. And I want to take a moment right now to pause and to recognize that since last Yom HaShoah, our greater community and our Beth Shalom community has lost a number of Nitzalei HaShoah, have lost a number of survivors of the Holocaust. There are so many tragedies upon tragedies within the year of the pandemic, year plus of the pandemic. One of the biggest losses is the fact that we haven't had large funerals. And Zoom funerals are not the same. And people are much less likely, in some ways they're more likely to tune into a Zoom funeral, and in some ways they're less likely to tune into a Zoom funeral than actually go. And there have been a number of survivors who have passed away and left this world this year that should have had hundreds of people physically accompanying them to the grave. And our children and our children's children who are those of us who have children and grandchildren alive right now have had the privilege of knowing Nitzalei HaShoah, of knowing firsthand survivors. And I was thinking about this morning after Minyan, is that one of the unique things about a synagogue community is the opportunity to have casual, informal relationships with different generations that doesn't exist in other social settings. Even if you have a survivor come speak to you at a public school or at the day school, that's different than that being Mr. or Mrs. such and such that you know from Kiddush, and you maybe help them bring their plate to their table, or maybe they gave you a piece of candy out of their tallis bag. It's a different relationship having a formal speech than having an informal interaction. And I was talking with Sean Mueller earlier during Pesach. Many of you know Sean and Alana, and so Sean is married. Sean is married to Rachel Balo, who Sherry's daughter, who is Kate Leibovitz's granddaughter, and Kate died last year at just about this time. And many of you knew Kate when she was healthy enough to come to shul. I knew her when she was already at Village Shalom. She was married to Eugene Leibovitz, who was also a survivor, and he did a lot of beautiful art for the synagogue. He was a tailor. I think he actually tailored some of President Truman's suits, if memory serves. And Kate was this amazing, beautiful woman who lived to see great grandchildren. And Kate's picture of her wedding is of her and Jean getting married in the ghetto. And they are wearing a beautiful suit and a beautiful dress with yellow stars sewn on her wedding dress. It is different seeing that picture in a history book than it is saying, I met Mrs. Leibovitz when I was volunteering with my class at Village Shalom. It's different. Or I remember Mrs. Leibovitz when I was a kid and I saw her at Kiddush, or I saw them at the Yom Tovim. It's different. And so I want to just acknowledge today that loss, and I want to share with us the machlokot, the disagreements that went on in establishing today as Yom HaShoah. So without peeking and us looking at the sources ahead of time, can somebody tell us why would there be a problem with us having Yom HaShoah today, on today, which is the 26th of Nisan? Why should we and why shouldn't we have it during this time? Anybody have any ideas of what they know about Jewish history or the Jewish calendar? Well,
couldn't it be during Pesach?
So why would it be during Pesach?
Well, depending on the Jewish calendar, I know Pesach has been this time of year, and therefore we wouldn't want to celebrate our freedom and then do this memorial.
Right. So first of all, Yom HaShoah falls on the Jewish calendar, so it's always the same number of days after Pesach as every other year.
Right, but there is something about, if I remember correctly, about when they set this, when they set this about Passover and Independence Day, and it was a huge discussion in Israel.
Correct. It was a huge discussion in the late 40s and early 50s in Israel, and that's the argument that we're going to talk about. And it's a different day than International Holocaust Remembrance Day. There was actually a good article in the Jewish Chronicle about this this past week, about the differences in the dates. And by the way, how you remember a historical event tells you a lot about your own personal or organizational or national biases. If you go to the United States Holocaust Museum in DC, it is different than Yad Vashem. They are both excellent museums, but they show two different schools of thought. The narrative of the United States Holocaust Museum is put the particularism of the story of the United States Holocaust Museum is the particularism of how it relates to the United States. And you see one of the final exhibits in the DC Museum, at least when I went there last, is the correspondence with Roosevelt about the information about being able, he could have bombed the train tracks going into Auschwitz. Chose not to. So the American narrative is the particularism that's associated with the United States Holocaust Museum. And there is a great universalism. There's a lot about the universalism at one of the, when Professor Wiesel was still alive, at one of the commemorations at the Holocaust Museum, I think it was during the Bush 43 administration, Professor and President Bush was there, and Wiesel was speaking, and Professor Wiesel looked directly at the president and said, "Mr. President, what are we going to do about Darfur?" Because the United States Holocaust Museum has taken on a greater narrative about all genocides, and that this is an education tool to teach the world about the potentiality of genocide. The Yad Vashem narrative is tying it into a specifically Jewish narrative and is part of the Jewish national story. And the ending of when you go to Yad Vashem, what do you see when you leave Yad Vashem? Anybody remember when you leave the museum, or when you go from the beginning of the museum to the end of the museum? Somebody want to summarize what you see, what you experience?
All of the camps were kind of in a big room.
Okay, and what about when you leave the museum? What do you see?
You see the trees along the walk that were planted in memory of the.
And you see the hills of modern Jerusalem.
Right.
Oh, okay.
You start, if you go, the entrance to Yad Vashem is very, very narrow. There's a little bit of light that comes in. When you exit Yad Vashem, it goes like this, and it's a big expansive window. When you leave that museum, you are seeing the modern state of Israel. You are seeing the result of Isaiah's prophecy, V'shabu banim ligvulam. You have brought and returned your children into your boundaries, into your borders. And that is integral to the Israeli narrative of Yad Vashem. So when we choose to memorialize the Holocaust, it tells us something about the memorializers. The International Holocaust Memorial Day is based on the Liberation Day of Auschwitz. Okay, when the Allies liberated Auschwitz. In other words, putting the focus of memorialization on the Western liberators. Yad Vashem, when Israel decided to choose a date, well, first of all, before we say how they chose the date, let's think of other possible dates. When, before Yom HaShoah, let's say you knew nothing about Yom HaShoah, give me a date that would make sense for Holocaust Memorial Day in the Jewish, from what you know about the Jewish calendar. Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av. It's the national day of Jewish mourning. We can memorialize not only the destruction of both temples, but we memorialize every single cataclysm that's befallen the Jewish people because of our exile from Israel. And if you go through the prayer book of Tisha B'Av, you will see, of a traditional prayer book, you're going to see dozens and dozens of liturgical poems written throughout history commemorating different times of massacres. So there's a theological and philosophical question comes up. Is the Shoah, is the Holocaust simply like all the other acts of anti-Semitism, but bigger? Or is it something unique? If it's the same but bigger and worse, then maybe it could be subsumed into Tisha B'Av. But if it's something that's different, unique, and we want to commemorate differently, maybe it needs its own day. So first of all, there was the feeling that the Holocaust was something historically unique. By the way, we today get in, that's another area of machloket all the time. When is it kosher to use a Holocaust analogy? Some say never. Some say when somebody is acting in a Nazi-esque way. And some say when somebody I disagree with acts in a Nazi-esque way. But if it's somebody that you disagree with and acts in a Nazi-esque way, no Nazi analogy for you, okay? So I have heard in the political discourse in America, we have seen Nazi analogies used to describe the treatment of immigrants at the border and the separation of children from their parents with refugees. I have also heard, and just in the last 2 weeks, we have seen Nazi analogies being made to requiring a digital vaccine passport, indicating governmental overreach. I have heard Nazi analogies regarding the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that the Obama administration entered into with Iran, because Iran is committed to Jewish genocide. They want to destroy the state of Israel, and they have said explicitly that they want nuclear capabilities to do so. So we have seen left, right, and center people being the targets of those who disagree with them by using Nazi analogies. But if you believe that the Holocaust is something historically unique, you have to either not use or rarely use that analogy. It's another example of pluralism and machloket regarding the Shoah. It is okay. Don't be embarrassed to raise your hand, okay? Raise your hand if you've never been to a synagogue to observe Tisha B'Av. It's okay. Don't be embarrassed. Everybody here? Oh my gosh. This is a select group. This is a select group. The vast majority of our congregation has never set foot in our synagogue for Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is completely irrelevant to 90% of congregation Beth Shalom. Okay? So I say this without even a hint of rabbinic guilt. Okay? I just say it as a matter of fact. Like, it is irrelevant. It is emotionally irrelevant. I'm not saying it should be or shouldn't be. It is. We would have to do a heck of a lot of Jewish education to make Tisha B'Av relevant to those who did not go to Jewish summer camps growing up and have to wear rope belts and black t-shirts and sing sad songs and make and do all sorts of other cockamamie activities that Jewish camps do on Tisha B'Av to make it relevant, okay? But if you did not have that experience and you are not an Orthodox Jew, you likely have no connection to Tisha B'Av or have European parents, okay? So that was one reason why Tisha B'Av was off the table. Then the rabbi said in Israel, you know what? We should look at the 10th of Tevet. The 10th of Tevet is a minor fast day. And even the Orthodox are not observing the 10th of Tevet very often. 10th of Tevet occurs like about 2 weeks after Hanukkah. It's in the middle of winter. It's the shortest fast day of the year. It's a sun up to sundown fast day. Nobody even remembers what it's for anymore. Okay, even amongst the religious. I mean, people observe it, but they observe it because, oh yeah, today's the 10th of Tevet. Got to fast today. And so some of the rabbis in the modern state of Israel in the late 40s and early 30s saying, you know what? We got this fast day that nobody's observing. We've got this horrible tragedy, the worst that our people have ever seen. And the way that we ritualize horrible things as we fast. Here's a fast day that no one's observing. Here's an event that everybody wants to find an emotional way to observe. Let's put them together. However, the 10th of Tevet was even more irrelevant than Tisha B'Av. Then came the idea, and we'll look at some writing by Yitz Greenberg about this. We don't want to just remember the pain. And this, by the way, has a long history in Judaism. The rabbis say that the Mashiach, the Messiah, is going to be born on Tisha B'Av. There is an idea that embedded in destruction are the seeds of rebuilding, are the seeds of hope. There's the famous story of Rabbi Akiva seeing a fox running around the ruins of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Holy Temple, and he's laughing and he's joyful. And they're saying, why are you joyful? And he says, because there's an actual prophecy in the prophets that the temple's going to be destroyed. It's going to be so ruinous that foxes will run through it. So, and there's also prophecies that we're going to return to our land. So if the first prophecy, I'm seeing the first prophecy come true right here. So if this prophecy of destruction can come true, then the prophecy of redemption and rebuilding can also come true. So Yom HaShoah, they decided, let's link it to the most important act of resistance in the history of World War II and the Shoah, which is the Jewish uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising began on Pesach. So they're like, let's do it then. But who was it who said before, Anne, we can't do it on Pesach. How can you do a National Memorial Day on Pesach itself? So that's the background. So let's look at a little bit of an article about this. This is from My Jewish Learning. And I put it in printer form. In just a second, I'm going to put the link for the actual article into our chat window. So give me just 1 second here. So if you want to read the entire article on your own, you can. Okay. There's also the idea that while the counting of the Omer is a time of semi-mourning, the month of Nisan, the entire month of Nisan, is itself festive. So, let me, Shira, Madam President, would you feel comfortable being our first reader today and read for us, beginning here, this paragraph? But unmute yourself, please. Or oh, I'm sorry, Shira. Shira, do you mind reading?
Oh, sure.
And
the Orthodox wanted to push the date as far back as possible from Passover, at least into the next month of Iyar, the second Hebrew month, so as not to infringe on the prohibitions of mourning and eulogies in the month of Nisan. If the date could be deferred to the month of Iyar, it would fall within the Sefirat HaOmer, mourning period between Passover and Shavuot, which would make it less troublingly, quote, innovative to the current mindset of the halakha authorities.
good. And so they want the they ended up fighting about this, and they ended up coming to a conclusion, which is the closest to the end of Passover. In other words, not right after Passover and not yet Rosh Chodesh. So it's not a joyful day, but it's still close to Passover, but not agreeing with that compromise position. I mean, excuse me, with that Orthodox position. So, Suzanne, would you mind reading for us this the highlighted paragraphs here? You have to unmute.
Okay. Oh, I'm on mute. Sorry.
No, now you got it. Now we hear you.
Okay. Starting for the Orthodox.
Yeah.
For the Orthodox, this was a breach of unmitigated joyfulness of the month. Setting this date for mourning directly violated a halakhic tradition, albeit a minor one. Indeed, the right-wing Orthodox were so unhappy that they have never accepted this date. In the late 1980s, elements of the Hasidic and the Agudas Yisrael communities began to participate in Yom HaShoah commemorations in New York City. There could be no compromise of a jot or tittle of the halakha. To somewhat assuage their feelings, the Orthodox were granted a further concession. If the memorial date fell on a Friday or Saturday, it would be postponed until Sunday. No one was satisfied with the outcome. The Orthodox were unhappy because they had been forced to accept an official day that incorporated a violation of the halakha. The fighters were unhappy because the commemoration was not on the day of the uprising. There was no significant event or special association with 27 Nisan. Thanks to the Shabbat protection, the Memorial Day was not even fixed on the same date every year. But the overall pressures to create a Memorial Day could no longer be denied. On April 12, 1951, the Knesset declared 27th of Nisan as Yom HaShoah, Umeret HaGetaot, Holocaust and Ghetto Revolt Remembrance Day. This day was soon referred to as Yom HaShoah, the HaGivurah, Destruction Holocaust, and Heroism Day. In 1953, the Memorial Authority was established and named Reshkut Zicharon Yad Vashem, Memory and Memorial Authority.
Right. So you can't separate Yad Vashem from Yom HaShoah. And because Yom HaShoah or Yad Vashem was established as part of the Israeli process that that established Yom HaShoah. So I want us to so you'll notice that today is not the 27th of Nisan. It's not the day that was established. Why? Because tomorrow is the 27th of Nisan, and what day is tomorrow? It is Friday, and so we don't have these sad days leading up to Shabbat. I'm going to skip to the end of the article, and Julie, would you mind? Can I call on you to read this last paragraph?
Sure. The 3 paragraphs.
Yeah, that I've highlighted.
As the commemoration day now stands, Passover joy is shadowed by Yom HaShoah. In effect, Passover is wounded but not destroyed, which is the truth witnessed by Jewish life after the catastrophe. Wounding is not destroying Passover, but not destroying Passover is another way of saying the covenant is broken but not defeated or replaced. Had the Orthodox gotten their way in the final negotiations, Yom HaShoah would have been deferred to the month of Iyar or beyond. Had that happened, there would have been no connection between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut. But in fact, Yom HaAtzmaut is the fundamental response to Yom HaShoah. Now, Yom HaShoah occurs 1 week away from Yom HaAtzmaut, and nothing could be more profoundly captured the fundamental relationship of Holocaust and Israel than that positioning. The state of Israel is not a reward or a product or an exchange for the Holocaust. It is a response. The Jewish people responded to the total assault of death by an incredible outpouring of life. The survivors came and rebuilt their lives. Jewish life was made precious again. The great biblical symbol that, according to the prophets, would someday prove that the covenant has endured is the reestablishment and repopulation of the land of Israel.
Beautiful. Thank you. So this is written by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and there is no contemporary theologian, I think, who speaks and writes more eloquently about post-Holocaust theology, of how do we conceptualize our covenantal relationship with God after the Holocaust and what its impact is by the state of Israel than Rabbi Greenberg. And he also has been a master at teaching about the holiness and centrality of the overall Jewish community outside of the land of Israel and the American Jewish community. But why I wanted to bring this to you is to show you how sometimes we're not even aware of the machlokot, of the disagreements that are, as it were, under the hood of the way that we practice Judaism. And there were, in fact, very significant and meaningful disagreements, really important ones, that lie underneath the choosing of the date of Yom HaShoah. And the compromise was not a compromise, but rather it was a different solution that really didn't honor anybody. Didn't really honor the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, and it didn't honor the guardians of the tradition in the Orthodox community. And what Rabbi Greenberg is saying is, in its very imperfection lies its uniqueness and durability and sustainability. Now, what's interesting is that Yom HaShoah as a unique day works in a society like Israel, where the whole country can shut down on Yom HaShoah. We don't observe Yom HaShoah on its day. When is our Yom HaShoah observance? It's on Sunday.
Hopefully
It's coming
Sunday.
Sunday.
Right.
And it's not because it should have fallen on Friday and they're pushing it up to Sunday. And this is no critique to MCHE, by the way, okay? This is the same kind of decision that Jewish communities around the entire United States make. If we're going to choose a Sunday, a day closest to Yom HaShoah, because that's an American weekend day that's not Shabbat, that we have the best chance of coming together as a community to observe this time. So we, in a sense, have gone through our own process in America of machloket and finding a new solution. I think, though, that going back to what I started at the beginning of talking about Sean Mueller's comment to me that this is the first Seder that he's been to this year that didn't have a Holocaust survivor present. The big challenges for us is going to be, how does Yom HaShoah continue to evolve? And will it continue to evolve as the generations become further from the firsthand experience? Do we stay with Yom HaShoah? Do we revert to Tisha B'Av? If we continue to, like right now, I try to go to Yom HaShoah every single year, Yom HaShoah observance every single year. It's, by the way, Kansas City is an amazing, I've been in other communities. We do an amazing job with it. It's beautiful. And one reason is because of the robust community of survivors that Kansas City was blessed to have after the war. Not every community has the same percentage of survivors as we do. And that has had an impact on our community. We see it in the memorial that's outside the JCC. That was one of the very first memorials to the Holocaust that was built in the United States. President Truman was at its dedication. But still, when I go, there's a disproportionate number of people who are themselves second generation or third generation survivors, as opposed to people who had no familial connection with the Shoah. So I think that some of the questions that we're going to have to be struggling with as a community is, how do we make the Shoah into an actual holiday that's lived and remembered through action, as opposed to an academic subject that you learn about in public school, Hebrew day school, or Hebrew school? How is it something that we actually ritualize and mourn together? And there will be further machlokot about that, I guarantee it. There's one thing that I'm certain of, is that we will have disagreements. So I'm going to wrap up there and close there. And I want to thank everybody. And I have 3 minutes or 4 minutes if people want to stay on for any questions. Naomi, you have your hand up. You need to unmute first.
Naomi, we can't hear you.
Naomi, you are muted.
Okay.
There you go.
A significant section of Yad Vashem is devoted to righteous Gentiles.
Absolutely.
It's been years since I was at the Holocaust Museum in DC. Does it have a section on righteous Gentiles?
I believe so. I don't remember. I believe so. Of course, the person who would be best to ask about that is Jonathan Edelman, Alan and Debbie's son, who has worked there and got his master's in museum education while working there, and is now working at a brand new Jewish museum that's the history of the Jewish community of Washington, D.C. So I'm almost certain, but they have an excellent and robust website, and you could look there and find out for sure.
Okay. And the reason I bring it up is that could be a way of keeping Yom HaShoah relevant here in the U.S. into the future.
It's an interesting idea of making a segment of every Yom HaShoah program, the righteous among the nations. I actually, by the way, that's how it's known. That's the direct translation, is righteous among the nations, which I actually like that translation better than righteous Gentiles. Gentiles simply means you're not Jewish. And I think it's in a sense, it speaks more to the universality of that idea that there can be righteous people regardless of nationality. There were righteous Poles, there were righteous Germans, there were righteous
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think that's brilliant, Naomi. Any other questions or comments before we close today? Okay, thank you everybody so much. And I'm going to hop off for my next Zoom meeting. And thank you, as always, for including me. And I just want to say how much I appreciate all that the Sisterhood does for our community. You guys did a great job with Torah Fund Lunch, and you're doing an amazing job of continuing to pivot during this pandemic.